The Mindset Advantage, a podcast by Arcadia Consulting, architects of change.
When disruption happens in our lives, such as a big change, we can find it difficult to let go of old habits, which can result in low self-esteem, poor performance, and negative outcomes. Today, Dan Spira is joined by Arcadia's neuroscientist, Andy Patterson, to discuss the neuroscience behind developing the new behaviours that change demands.
Welcome to this episode of The Mindset Advantage. I'm Dan Spira, a global partner at Arcadia Consulting, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Andy Patterson, who is going to talk with us about the neuroscience of accelerating and leading through change. In this conversation, we talk about the mechanisms of the human brain that can be harnessed to be a more effective change leader. Please enjoy this conversation with Andy Patterson. Andy, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Andy Patterson. I'm also a global partner with Arcadia. My specialist area is in the neuroscience of behavior and cognition. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about that, Dan.
That's awesome. I'm super excited about this topic. I know some people think of neuroscience as a little bit of a nerdy topic, and I guess you could say I consider myself a little bit of a nerd with you, Andy. First of all, can you give us a high level, help us understand what we mean by neuroscience and how it relates to this topic of leading through change and mindset?
Yeah, sure, Dan. Neuroscience has really been changing over the years. You know, it used to be sort of very functional subject, very difficult to study the brain. And so a lot of it was very, if you like, uncertain, speculative. And in the modern day, particularly in the last 30 years, we've got tools that can measure what's happening in the brain, which has really opened up a whole new world. So it's a way of understanding human behavior. So in that way, it's similar to psychology and anthropology, but because the brain controls our behavior. So it's important using the latest tools to try and bring the understanding from neuroscience to understanding the aspects of human behavior.
How did you come to get so excited about neuroscience?
Well, my original training was in science and engineering. I could never really understand human behavior until I looked at it from a scientific point of view. That's just me, I think. But other people, particularly other engineers and scientists and technical people, I think, find human behavior a strange subject. And looking at the science and the systems view that neuroscience gives us, I think is one way that I can understand human behavior, which I have to say, until I started studying it in this way, I really didn't have a good grasp of.
Yeah, I totally share your excitement about that, Andy. For the less technically inclined, what would be your pitch to them? Why does neuroscience matter for someone who is in leadership, for example?
I think that the essence of it is that human behavior is a bit of a mystery to us all of our lives. Why do we do certain things that clearly aren't good for us? Why do we behave in the way that we do when we're not getting the outcome that we really want? So the pitch that I would make to somebody to understand this is there are things that are really, really easy to understand if you understand the mechanisms underlying them. And so some of those mysterious things will become simple. The things that put people off are all the terminology that neuroscientists use, which is frankly a bit of a barrier to getting involved in the subject. So I hope today, Dan, that I don't confuse you with too many technical terms. I'll try and keep it as simple as I can.
That's all right. I am sold. The idea of mechanism, I just thinking about with my kids growing up when they were toddlers, one of the things I taught them to do was to become aware of when they were hungry and tired. It's amazing when one becomes aware of one's own mechanisms, of one's own nervous system, how powerful that can be. From a leadership perspective, understanding, I think, how the brain works is a powerful map to navigate the territory of humans, emotions, change, and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of change, since we're here to talk really about the 7 mindsets around navigating change. At a high level, again, what would you say? How does mindset show up in the brain? And in particular, how do these different mindsets manifest on a brain level?
The easiest place to start is by talking about memory. The brain, without memory, the brain is really just a functional device with a load of buttons in it. It's memory that makes the whole thing hang together. And when I say memory, people think that memory is all about what happened in the past. But actually, memory controls our current behavior and the way we see the future. So the way that it really works is, memory shapes the way that the brain behaves. One of the interesting aspects of this is fairly recently, 35 years ago, we discovered that there are actually two memory systems in the brain. And these two systems are very, very different. And those two memory systems combine to make our behavior what it is. They both work in very opposite ways. So when you look at the way that the memory systems operate, it tells you a lot about how human mindset controls our behavior.
So when you say memory, what I'm hearing is patterns of behavior. And again, going back to this idea of increasing self-awareness, understanding how our brain works so that we can predict more easily or understand and not be overwhelmed by circumstances. What would you say are these different memory systems, and how would you characterize them?
Yeah, if we start with the most powerful of these memory systems, it's called implicit memory, and we term the other memory system explicit, but they're just labels. Implicit memory controls the capabilities, most of the capabilities that we have, whether they're sort of physical movement, the ability to play sports, or whether they're our social demeanor, our emotional makeup, the way that we're feeling at that point in time, and the way that we relate to other people, our relationships, our teamwork, and all those kinds of things. And this memory system is very, very slow to learn, but can learn things in parallel and associate large numbers of things together. And for example, it gives humans the ability to speak and to communicate with language. So all of that is driven by a set of very complex patterns that are basically goal-driven by the executive part of the brain that issues a basic statement like a goal, like, okay, I want to describe to Dan about the memory systems. It communicates the kind of ideas, but then the phraseology is all produced by our implicit memory. So implicit memory is a really, really powerful thing at controlling our human behavior.
Awesome. So I feel like there's another side to this, Andy. Keep going, please.
Well, the other system is called explicit memory, and that's the one we actually think of as memory. That remembers things as they happen. We can delve into that memory and ask it questions. It's how we remember our timeline from the time that we were born. And it basically controls things like rules and logic and facts and names and things like that. So it's much more accessible to our consciousness. It's not that we're unconscious about implicit memory, but it's basically triggered and goal-driven rather than something that we're actually controlling all of the time. So the two are very, very different. If you look at explicit memory, then obviously you remember it the first time. Actually, you remember it better the more recent it is, and it tends to fade over time. It's quite hard work for the brain to call up explicit memories. They use a lot of energy in the brain, and it's single tasking. You can only really use explicit memory and the systems associated with it, the explicit system, in a single tasking mode. Whereas if you look at implicit memories, they take a long time to form. They're slow learning, but you don't forget them. Riding a bike would be an example of implicit memory. And people say, you never forget how to ride a bike. It works very quickly. It's very, very low energy. It has massive parallel processing within it, and it's spontaneous. It's very, very quick. and it's completely unaffected by other things that we're doing. It can be done in parallel with all sorts of other things. So the two memory systems are very, very different.
That's great. So we've got the explicit, we've got the implicit. You also mentioned the executive function. How does the executive function relate to both of these systems, would you say?
Well, if you think about your consciousness, where you actually think, that's actually in the front of the brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex, PFC, and that's connected to both of these systems. So you can think of the two systems as being composed of functions in the brain that are assembled together to perform particular tasks. On the rules and logic side, we apply some constraints to our behavior based on things like the law or the rules or organizational procedures or process. And on the other side, we're controlling the way that we interact with other people, our dialogue, our language, the jargon that we use at work, and our relationships with other people.
That's great. So with that foundation, Andy, let's take a look at the mindset advantages. I'll rattle off a few of these. You don't need to go through each and every one, but pick out one that suits you. We've got leadership care, well-being, resilience, growth mindset, thrive under pressure, high-performing teams. These are the different mindset, we'll call the mindset advantages, the different approaches or patterns for leaders to help themselves and their teams through change. If you don't mind, take one or two of those, Andy, and walk us through the implicit, explicit memory systems and how they play out with one or two of those mindsets.
If we take something like growth mindset is something that plays to both the explicit and the implicit systems, but it's a realization and a mindset that says that setbacks are something that you wish to bounce back from and to learn from. So it's very much trying to control your initial reaction to something happening, which let's say is an error or a mistake. It could be something which is a technical error, or it could be something that's a relationship error with somebody. And what the mindset does is basically allow you to avoid the emotional kickback from that and to actually look on the positive side that you've just received an opportunity to learn. So our mindset and the particular selection of the implicit memory will determine whether we react badly to that setback or react well. So by training ourselves to have the sort of learning mindset, growth mindset, then you're able to pursue a course of making sure that continuous improvement, just becomes a natural thing for you.
Nice. Let's look at if you don't mind, the resilience. I want to go back to my example of the hungry and tired individual. Let's call it the individual's hungry and tired, and building that self-care, that well-being, and also a little bit of that resilience, that attitude in the face of stress and change. Talk to me about how these two systems can be harnessed better to cope with external pressures or even internally generated pressures of stress due to change.
Yeah, and change basically has the effect, particularly if it's a change that is new and it's created a new environment for us. It tends to take away the implicit memories that relate to our situation. So imagine that you were changing your job. You have implicit memories in your previous job that tell you what the jargon is, how things are done, where the coffee machine is, who does what around here, what's the best way to get certain things accomplished. And then, you change jobs, your day one, maybe you've even changed the role that you do. All the implicit memories that were guiding you automatically through your day have gone. They vanished. And when that happens with the implicit system, it basically throws control back to the explicit system. And the explicit system, as we just talked about, is energy inefficient. It consumes huge amounts of mental energy all the time that you're using it. So 8 hours of continuously thinking about all of those things in a way which is single tasking, fairly ineffective, will provide you with essentially stress and exhaustion. So you're tired, you're exhausted, simply from the fact that you have no implicit memories to automatically flow you through the day. So that the consequence of doing that is that you arrive home in the evening feeling completely shattered, having done effectively very little during the day. So that's an example where change creates this environment which exhausts us, makes us feel very bad. The brain is 2% of the mass of a human being, but it consumes 10% of the energy. The explicit system consumes a huge amount more than the average. So you're burning a tremendous amount of energy and depleting all of the glucose resources in the blood. And you'll basically be in a state of high stress when you get home at the end of the day. And that's one of the reasons why human beings really hate those new environments.
Yeah, I'm thinking about those new environments for those who went from working in an office to working at home with Zoom calls. How does this resonate, Andy? I heard once that being on video calls all day, seeing yourself, increased cognitive load and burnout. Maybe it's an explicit memory system, I don't know. Or maybe there's some other effect there. Versus occasionally turning the camera off and switching back to voice only can, for some individuals, actually help them replenish mental energy. Any thoughts on that particular pattern and how that might play out with these systems?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The voice only component of a conversation is something that we've learned to do automatically through the use of telephone systems for all of our lives. The introduction of live video created a whole new aspect that people weren't really used to. And therefore, you're right, it did trigger a high cognitive load. People were trying to relate to the video content. It disturbed their thinking processes and would have led, and I think did lead, to a lot of discomfort. A lot of the times when we talk about implicit versus explicit systems, the implicit system has this comfort blanket around you, the feeling comfortable, and a voice-only conversation is actually a much more comfortable conversation for us. However, I do believe that after a period of time and exposure, the implicit system would have learned to cope with the use of video. So over time, over, let's say, a period of a couple of months, we've typically measured the improvement in behavioral terms on the adjustment of comfort that you get in adjusting to video being there too. And in fact, in our field of work, where we often facilitate live workshops and things like that, it's the live workshops that have become, if you like, more stressful because we're simply not used to those, and so that's another transition, another change to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And even allowing people to move around a bit more, use standing desks, all these little tweaks can, as you mentioned, help replenish the energy that's getting depleted by this expensive muscle called our brain. Let's look at another side of change. Andy, let's talk about social change within teams. So you mentioned the social dynamics and relationships. If you don't mind, comment a little bit about what it's like to have changes within the makeup of a team in terms of people. We know that different people are in stages of the workforce joining teams at different stages. So there's a little bit of a life cycle there, their social integration into a team. And then we also have more diversity and inclusion and a more global workforce, increasingly global workforce. So lots of changes on the people front. Talk to us a little bit about the neuroscience of these changing social relationships at work.
Yeah, so when we analyze relationships with other people, one of the things that we could understand, I think, a little bit more easily is that the implicit memory of somebody else is the essence of the relationship you have with that other person. So it starts off with no real understanding of the other person. And over time, over interactions and spending time and observing people in different modes of behavior, you start to form an expectation of the reactions of the other person. And this extends then to teams in the sense that you get used to who will do what in a team, who will take what lead, who will respond to others, and not just in your own relationship with members of the team, but in the other members of the team's relationship with each other. So that forms a very complex social behavioral pattern that the team starts to share and adopt together. So we form implicit memory that, in a sense, are shared with other team members because they experience the same interactions that we do. So they form similar memories. It's not exactly the same from each perspective, but the team collectively has a persona, a kind of a mask, if you will, on their behavior that adjusts their behavior to be as productive as possible with those other members and to cause the minimum amount of disruption. This can lead to, higher performing teams. Sometimes it leads to lower performing teams, but there's definitely an effect on the team dynamic. And new members coming into that team can disrupt or eventually perhaps improve the performance of that team. Usually takes a while for the team to start to perform, if you like, at a higher level or an improved level.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about that change curve on a team level, it's actually on the individual level. So the mindset of leadership, care, well-being might be important for, let's say, the new folks who've joined a team, or maybe folks on the team who've experienced a disruption, whereas other members of the team might do well to have the high-performing team mindset applied, more so because they've gelled already and they've formed, as you say, these patterns or these expectations of each other's implicit memories. So we're getting really into the application of the neuroscience. What would you say at a high level can leaders do to lead their teams based on neuroscience? So this is a really broad question, Andy. What can leaders do more of, less of, based on what we've covered so far?
Well, remember that there are various stages to the change process that an individual faces. So, in the case I said about starting a new job, day one is tough. It's an environment where somebody really needs to be looked after. And so this concept of leadership care, just saying, look, we're here, to look after you. We appreciate it's your first day, we're going to help you through some of these early difficult moments where you have to learn, where's the coffee machine and, what goes on here, who's important, how do we make decisions, how do we get things done. So there's a kind of a care element that comes into the start of the process. The objective of leaders should always be to accelerate people through this change curve with the minimum disruption, keeping the low points as high as you can, and gradually moving through the change process. Because what happens after we've lost all of the familiarity of our workplace implicit memory is we start to try and rebuild it. But in trying to rebuild it, you have setbacks. You still don't have implicit memories that allow you to automatically navigate through the maze. So you really need to develop and have fostered by leaders some form of resilience, some form of expectation that you are going to see this through. It's going to take time, but things are going to get better. So there's this concept of coping in the early days with setbacks. And then a very important process starts to occur, which is you start to acquire parts of the pattern, just pieces, a relationship that has been built to the point of some level of trust, a certain amount of knowledge, a certain amount of familiarity with the terminology and the jargon. So this creates enough of a framework. It's not fully populated for you to start working with other individuals to very much accelerate the process of learning that implicit memory. And leaders can be very, very active during that stage in terms of coaching people, in terms of rewarding them for small wins, small things that you're successful at really feed the growth of new implicit memories. So anything leaders can do to encourage learning, reward success, give compliments, and that kind of thing will help people up that curve. And then, towards the end of this pattern gradually starting to complete, there's another sort of phase which will kick in, which is we're able to perform pretty well now. And the leaders now need to raise the bar. They need to start challenging people to get to really high performance and to really make the teams operate. So I think a lot of the answer, Dan, about what leaders need to do is appreciate the changes that people are going through as they're going through them and change their style according to where people are through that process.
Nice. So flexibility is the key. I also wonder, Andy, in terms of the emotions that we've been talking about, we've often heard the terms sympathetic, fight or flight response, parasympathetic, rest and digest response. What would you say can leaders be more aware of with respect to these systems of sympathetic and parasympathetic responses?
Well, the stress situation, when I talked about when the implicit system is gone in terms of its support, people are thrown onto explicit thinking, pure cognition. That's the essence of driving people away from a rest and digest situation, away from the parasympathetic nervous system towards a sympathetic nervous system response of being very stressed and ready to deal with threats, which is what effectively the workplace would have become in that environment. So we basically are operating in a continuous mode most of the way through the change curve, at work at least, where the sympathetic nervous system is switched on. And it's always been quite hard to switch on the parasympathetic nervous system. It doesn't start itself up just because the threat is immediately dispersed. So what will happen is that the body and the mind goes into a coping state. And the coping state is a bit like somebody spinning plates. There's lots of things to balance in order to try and maintain some sense of recovery from the stressful situations. And that's actually a situation that's pretty common in modern life these days. So the advice is that leaders need to make sure that their people have coping strategies, ways that they can place themselves in situations where there's safe places, where they can spend some relaxation time, and use their use some form of breaks in order to sort of relieve the situation of constant stress. So because the brain really doesn't like being stimulated continuously in this sympathetic nervous system state.
Thanks for going down that little bit of that rabbit hole on the sympathetic and parasympathetic, Andy. So taking it back to the level of learning, in a word, what would you say is the most important thing to do to unlearn? Because we know that sometimes unlearning can be just as important in navigating change as learning. Well,
yeah, unlearning something is really quite difficult, much more difficult than people think. The things that are direct and put in place an implicit memory are what we call triggers. So the triggers tend to fire automatically. So in the case of riding a bike, simply sitting on a bike will trigger all of the balance systems that are necessary to ride a bike. So it's just automatic. Sitting in a car, driving a car, it's just an automatic system. If you want to unlearn some behaviors in your implicit memory system, one of the best tricks is to remove some of the triggers or introduce something in there as an alternative trigger try and trigger a different kind of mindset response. So, for example, you might use a particular phrase to cause an interrupt to normal behavior, and I'll use something to remind you to trigger a different type of behavior. So there are lots of tricks to stop invoking an automatic response, which is essentially what happens most of the time to our implicit system. So you're absolutely right. The fact that we have implicit memories does tend to drive bad behavior sometimes, as well as some good behavior too.
We often hear about chemicals, neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin. Seems that a lot of folks are throwing these terms around quite a bit. What's your take on these neurotransmitters, and in particular in relation to everything we've discussed so far?
Well, Dan, I try not to describe the brain in terms of one particular neurotransmitter or others, or even the whole group of the more common neurotransmitters that are medically used and are often discussed in terms of their effect on our behavior. And one of the simple reasons is that they are very important in terms of things like changing our mood and things like that, but they don't really differentiate us as humans from any other animals or mammals. So all other mammals basically have those neurotransmitters. They have the same kind of reactions to the way that they're processed. Whereas when we look at the behavior of systems, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the way that implicit memory is processed, human beings are vastly different to other animals. And so there's nothing really that I can say about neurotransmitters which would differentiate human behavior.
Andy, thank you so much. In summary, it sounds like navigating change, the goal is to help people move through that curve with the least dip possible, and recognizing or harnessing the power of the implicit systems, and managing the cognitive load or the energy of the explicit system. What else would you say to summarize? What have I missed in this brief summary of what we've talked about?
Yeah, I think you caught most of it, Dan. I think the sequence it works in is you lose this comfort blanket. You're thrown into a situation where you need to gradually rebuild. It takes time, and that time can be accelerated by focus on learning, relationships with people, building a knowledge of the language, the jargon, and those kinds of things, so that you can form new memories with the new work group and the new environment. So and to appreciate that all of those things are slightly different techniques as we go through the process. So don't get fixed in one mode of operation. You've got to be able to flex as you move through this.
Well, thanks so much, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, please subscribe to the podcast and stay tuned for more from the Mindset Advantage by Arcadia Consulting. You've been listening to The Mindset Advantage. Follow Arcadia Consulting on social media platforms to stay updated.